Steve Sims, former professor of physics at the Thomas University, delicately pushed aside a brushy tree branch and looked down to where the little town had been. He wasn't there any longer, but there wasn't a single monstrous atomic bomb crater as he might have expected. Half a dozen relatively small craters, no more than 200 to 300 feet across, had obliterated a third of the town and entirely flattened the rest. Then there'd been a fire. There was nothing left.
Welcome to Our Nuclear Nightmares, a series examining the literature of the nuclear age. The following program contains material and themes that some listeners may find disturbing. Discretion is advised. Episode 2. Fight for Life. The year is 1947. British India ceases to exist as it is divided into an independent India and Pakistan. The partition line, drawn by the last British Viceroy Lord Mountbatten, sets off one of the largest refugee crises in history. Almost 20 million seek refuge as sectarian violence breaks out, and over 1 million men, women, and children are killed. The Hungarian Communist Party, led by Matthias Rákosi, who is backed by Joseph Stalin, dismantles the Social Democratic Party and the Independent Smallholders Party. This leaves the Communists in complete control of the government to carry out various political purges in the following decade. President Harry Truman signs into law the National Security Act, which creates a Department of Defense, the Central Intelligence Agency, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the National Security Council, the military and political structures that come to define the Cold War. Fight for Life was written by William Fitzgerald Jenkins and first published in the United States by Crestwood Publishing. Fight for Life begins with Steve Sims, a physics professor, gazing at the ruins of his hometown and recalling his journey to get to that point. After waiting several months in the ruins of Thomas University for someone to come along and help rebuild civilization, he decided to make the 400-mile journey home alone. During the journey, he joined a rough gang where he committed murder before escaping. He then moved on to a, quote, an uninformed but resolute community, unquote, that he leaves after an unspecified period. As he considers what to do next, he notices movement in the ruins and sees someone being pursued. At first, he's inclined to stay out of the affair. However, when he notices that the person is a woman, he races down and kills her pursuer with his needle-sharp foil.
Some 5 minutes later, Steve cleaned the foil painstakingly. There had been tobacco in the dead man's pockets, and he'd had a rusty knife and a flask of poisonously vile liquor. Also, there were 4 diamond rings and a child's necklace. Somehow, the child's necklace removed any distaste Steve might have otherwise felt for what he had done.
After going through the attacker's pockets for anything of value, Steve talks with a girl who introduces herself as Frances. He offers her a knife so she can defend herself and the food he has left since she looks hungry. They find a place to settle for the night, and Steve explains to her his treatise on the paradox of indeterminacy, which he simplifies as the idea that when you are dealing with small numbers of objects, the laws of chance come into play rather than that of physics. Steve is surprised when Frances instantly grasps the concept. He is even more surprised when she mentions her father would have loved the idea and realizes that he knew her father. He had been instrumental in getting him into the study of physics. Frances recounts how she was away from town when it was obliterated and managed to survive by living with an aunt. One day, Frances came home to find the aunt had been shot to death. After that, she joined a group of wanderers for protection, but found no help from the women in the group, while the men were even worse. She had run away, which is when she encountered Steve. Frances mentions one person in the group who was kind to her, a man named Lucky Connors, who she claims does in fact have fantastic luck. Eventually, Frances falls asleep, and Steve continues to write and brood about the state of things.
The world was headed for barbarism unless some nation, somewhere, had improbably succeeded in keeping itself intact while the rest of the world went headlong toward destruction. And if one nation retained its civilization, the odds were that it would eventually enslave the survivors of all the rest.
Steve is startled when he hears footsteps approaching, but when he goes to attack the unseen stranger, his foil snaps and he's knocked unconscious. When he wakes up, he discovers the invader from the night before was the aforementioned Connor, whose luck has indeed held, as neither of them was killed in the short fight. Connor is a carefree spirit who joins and helps out with the food. He talks about how he survived the attack and then one day while exploring a crater came upon a strange rock. While holding the rock, he wished he had some food, and a moment later an owl flying past dropped the rabbit it was carrying. Connor describes how he used the rock multiple times since then and found that while it can accomplish many things, it cannot make unrealistic things happen. Based on Connor's description, Steve theorizes that the rock is uranium, which, when irradiated by a nuclear blast, gains special attributes. Steve asks to try the rock, and after half an hour, as he's beginning to doubt himself, an enemy plane falls out of the sky and crashes, which is what he had wished. Steve and the others retreat from the crash site to an assumed safe distance and wait. Another aircraft arrives at the crash site, lands, and deploys personnel who investigate. After a while, they get back into the aircraft and lift off after destroying the crash ship with bombs. Steve surmises this is to remove any chance of salvage and make it appear that the enemy aircraft never suffer problems. He also theorizes that the special rock is amplifying will, which in turn affects the wheel of probability. Connor takes the rock back and wishes for clothing, and soon they come across a dead car with a suitcase of clothes inside. They keep walking and eventually come to an abandoned farm with an orchard that is still green. That night, after settling in, Steve asks Connor for the rock again and wishes for what he calls trained men so that they can fight back against the enemy and rebuild civilization.
Quickly, Lucky scanned Steve's face. Then he shrugged. Go ahead and try, he said dryly. If it was luck that broke down civilization, maybe luck could build it up again. But I think you're missing something, fella. The bombs smashed the cities, but if folks had wanted to keep law and order and such, they could done it. Some places they wanted to, and they did for a while. But this thing, it won't change people. The way people are ain't an accident, and no accident or any luck is gonna make 'em something else. I tried to make the gang Francis see me with act different, but it didn't work. But you go ahead and try.
Nothing happens that night, and in the morning Steve finds both Connor and Francis missing and thinks he's been betrayed. Steve is angered by the fact the special stone had power, but not enough to fix the state of the world. As he continues to rage, he fantasizes about killing Lucky, who he hates, and taking Francis for himself even if she hates him for it. While walking around the ruins of the settlement, he hears gunfire and runs towards the source, where he finds Connor on the ground unconscious, with Francis standing over him, trying to ward off a group of savage men who are throwing stones. Steve tries to fight off the encroaching savages, but there are dozens and not enough bullets. Francis grabs a rock and makes a wish, and soon the savages fall over, convulsing in pain, which allows the group to escape. Once they're safe, Steve guesses that Connor wished to figure out the rock, which led to the attack, which allowed Francis to use it, which demonstrated what the rock could do. After regaining consciousness, Connor gives part of the rock to Francis, and another to Steve, after commenting he had pulled for him to be a square guy. Steve thinks back to when he had joined a community after defecting from a group of raiders. He had helped the community ambush the raiders, but they were then bombed by the enemy and destroyed.
Steve returned to find gigantic craters where the village and most of the farms had been, and the blast effect had destroyed all the rest. Steve returned to find gigantic craters where the village and most of the farms had been, and the blast effect had destroyed all the rest. And he knew then that the falling of the bombs on that small and resolute village was not an accident. It followed too closely their success in defending themselves against looters. It was a consequence of that success. The people who had planes and bombs wanted all other civilization destroyed. They preferred it to destroy itself, but they would let no seed of future rivalry survive. Unquestionably, among the looters and bandits there were agents of the people with the planes and the bombs, watching lest any sanity or decency remain anywhere.
Steve tells Francis and Connor that the enemy might notice the defense they made and they quickly move out. As they travel, Steve uses the rock to wish for certain things, both to help with their continued survival and test the rock's abilities. That evening, Steve kisses Francis, but immediately apologizes, only for her to inform him that she used her rock to wish for it. After more wandering, they return to the farm with the orchard, figuring that if the enemy had noticed their defense, they would have done something about it. Steve tells the other about his time with a community that defended itself and was destroyed for its efforts.
There can't be an atomic battle, Steve pointed out. There can only be atomic massacre. There can't really be an atomic war. There can only be contest and destruction. And there can't be conquest by atomic bombs. You can kill people with them, but you can't conquer them. So when this thing started, the United States couldn't be conquered. It could only be smashed, which it was.
Steve continues, outlining how he thinks the enemy is proceeding. Unable to conquer America, they plan to keep using nuclear weapons to wipe out any signs of resistance or rebuilding, until they have enough population to come and occupy the land. He also says he has an idea of how to defeat the enemy, but does not elaborate further. While they settle into sleep, Connor has a confidential conversation with Steve where he reveals he wished for Francis's love, but that did not happen, and now he plans to take a risk by finding one of the enemy agents. Steve argues against the plan, but lets Connor go in the end. Over the next few days, Steve and Francis slowly fix up the house, while he also experiments with the rock and his theory on indeterminacy. One day Francis hears a commotion, and they see three armed strangers and go out to greet them. The strangers are suspicious, however. They are part of a group of survivors who are being pursued by raiders. Steve and Francis get the survivors into the house and barricade it just before the raiders arrive. Steve uses his stone to boost the fight against the raiders, who become scattered and panicked. He uses the opportunity to infiltrate their lines, find the enemy agent, and kill them. He also finds a microwave transmitter that the agent used to signal the planes. Steve returns to the house where Francis tells him that she used her stone to wish for the survivors to get better, and relates some of the stories they told her of their desperate struggle to stay alive.
They had been a group of farmers and their families, closely knit by blood ties, who had not followed the common urge of normal folk. They had been fiercely independent, and their small holdings were remote from the rich lands the looters preyed on at first. They were watchful. They were prudent. They closed ranks when the world collapsed about them, and tried to go on as sturdily as before. Their houses were close together, but did not form a village.
After listening to their story, Steve tells the survivors about his plan to destroy the enemy. Over the course of a few weeks, they work together to rebuild and recreate things ranging from a power generator to penicillin. They also build a system that powers the wishing stones that they can wish for more food and other things. One day, Connor reappears and recounts his adventures of tracking raiders, killing agents, and examining their technology. He also discovered that the enemy set up caches of weapons and liquor, and then informed agents of where they can be found to keep the raiders supplied. Connor also found out that the microwave sets can be used to locate each other. Steve has made small advances with wiring the wish stones, but is forced to take a huge gamble when the house is attacked by raiders and the agent among them radios for a bomber. Bombs start to fall, but Steve at the last second manages to wire the wish stones to amplify the power, which wipes out the bombs and then the bomber. After the battle, he gets the others to help create a shield that will protect the house against any other attacks, then takes some of the survivors to assault the enemy base, which he was able to locate using the microwave set. The group packs weapons and supplies and then makes a 200-mile trek to the enemy base. Once there, Steve orders them to incapacitate the guards, and then gets inside one of the control rooms where he uses the phone and demands to talk to the general in charge. When the person on the other end, who doesn't speak English, prevaricates, Steve uses the stones to obliterate one of the buildings. Steve blows up several more facilities until the enemy agrees to surrender, and the novel ends with the survivors triumphant. Jenkins completed Fight for Life less than a year after Murder of the USA, which gave him the distinction of having written the first nuclear war novel and the first nuclear post-apocalypse novel. In both novels, the enemy is an ambiguous nation with an authoritarian aesthetic. No reason is given for the attack either: religion, ideology, resources, or territory. Only vague hints about big power politics. There was still some lingering reluctance among writers to designate the Soviet Union as a future nuclear enemy. They had been a wartime ally, and the Cold War had not yet evolved into an existential struggle. Instead, stories typically featured mad scientists or secret organizations as enemies. In the novel, the enemy has almost no presence outside the occasional glimpse of the bombers and the few soldiers encountered in the last chapter. The real reminder of the enemy is in the devastation they have caused. It's evident Jenkins was not interested in the politics of a nuclear war, but focused on the themes of survival and its aftermath. The novel has pronounced pulp overtones. The capable and world-weary scientist, the plucky sidekick, and the love interest against seemingly impossible odds and menaced by faceless enemies. The situation changed by a chance discovery of a piece of uranium exposed to nuclear blast that essentially becomes a wishing stone. This idea comes across as somewhat absurd today, but such a wild idea was not out of place at the time. Nuclear science was still in its infancy, and relatively little was understood outside of the basics of fission, which allowed for wild speculation about what might be possible. The Atomic Energy Commission, established in 1946, was already making claims that atomic energy would allow for breakthroughs in biology, agriculture, and medicine. Magazines and newspapers were filled with breathless pieces that claimed that atomic energy would improve everything from cars to cosmetics. Companies rushed out advertising campaigns with concept art of future nuclear-powered or enhanced inventions. Serious articles were published saying that all manner of illnesses and diseases would soon be cured. Nuclear energy would somehow make deserts into verdant fields and control the weather. The government eagerly made similar promises about nuclear power, hoping to offset the gloom people felt over the existence of nuclear weapons. In this torrent of promises and without any systematic pushback from scientists, the public had little ability to discern rational extrapolation from pure speculation. This optimism would dissipate in the mid-60s when it became obvious the breakthroughs would never come, and the dangers of nuclear weapons became more clear. Nuclear reactions and radiation were still little known at this point. Some of this was due to a deliberate government campaign to cover up the facts about radiation exposure and sickness observed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This campaign was demolished by John Hershey's reporting from both cities in 1946, which was carried in nearly all major newspapers. However, long-term effects from fallout were practically unknown. Few experiments or surveys have been undertaken in Japan or at American test sites. Again, some of this was a deliberate choice by the American government. It's one reason why many early stories, including this novel, rarely mention fallout or radiation poisoning. Despite this oversight, the novel contains many of the aesthetics of a nuclear post-apocalypse, with its blasted landscape, ruined buildings, vicious biker gangs, hard-bitten survivors, and the desperate search for supplies. All of these ingredients would become staples of the nuclear post-apocalyptic genre. What is most notable is that while the enemy is an ever-present danger, the greatest threat comes from the other survivors. If you had a bookshelf filled with every nuclear post-apocalypse book ever published and went through them, you would find the same weary survivors trekking through the same ruins and fighting the same enemies with little variation. Of course, some of this can be attributed to the attractive simplicity of the genre. The post-apocalypse offered a fantastic setting for writers. Some use the setting for thinly disguised westerns or entirely undisguised fantasy adventures. What makes this novel notable is that, while the enemy is an ever-present danger, the greatest threat comes from the other survivors. The country is presented as a place where society is broken into small, insular, suspicious units who often resort to violence. While cynicism bordering on nihilism regarding the nature of the human race was not unique to post-apocalyptic stories, it was a pronounced theme in nuclear literature in the United States. Popular culture has created an idealized past where Americans were more united and less polarized, especially during the war and following the economic boom, but nostalgia is not history. In 1943, the journalist Selden Menifee traveled 15,000 miles across the country interviewing people from all walks of life, which he would later publish in Assignment USA. In 1943, the journalist Selden Menifee traveled 15,000 miles across the country interviewing people from all walks of life, which he would later publish in the book Assignment USA. He found widespread bigotry, racism, anti-Semitism, worker exploitation, and class strife. Black people were subject to Jim Crow laws throughout the United States. And were attacked and killed in the South for trying to vote. Latinos fought against the same segregation in schools and workplaces. Asians suffered under the Chinese Exclusion Act and other restrictive policies. Homosexuality was illegal, and almost any expression of it could result in fines or imprisonment. Once the war ended, labor disputes exploded across the country in a huge wave of strikes for better wages. Almost a third of Americans lived in poverty. Almost the same amount lived in homes with no running water. Even at the end of the booming 50s, a quarter would remain in poverty, especially in rural areas and minorities in urban zones. The United States was marked by divisions many believed could tear the country apart. That something was wrong. These divisions were exacerbated by the Cold War, as people were told they were surrounded by enemies waiting for a single moment of weakness to attack. Worse, there were also enemies hidden among them. A neighbor, colleague, friend, maybe even husband or wife. All of these fears were present in nuclear literature, particularly in the post-apocalypse. It is the underlying reason why so many stories in the genre feature people turning on each other in desperate circumstances. The stories never changed because the tensions and contradictions in the United States fundamentally never changed. Even the dystopian novels now written decades after the end of the Cold War still contain the same pessimistic themes. The stories people told each other in the nuclear age are still with us today. If you found this episode interesting, entertaining, or a useful sleeping aid, please consider subscribing to the Patreon. This series is only possible through listener support. You can also help by leaving a review on iTunes or Spotify.